first presenter today is Jane Rieger, who's a flautist, I believe Americans say flutist, composer, improviser, educator from the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, ranging from solo acoustic pieces to multidisciplinary electronic ensemble pieces. Her works investigate relationships between the environment, language, and gesture through improvisation and interaction. Her current projects include a new commission to be premiered in June of this year on the Izu Peninsula in Japan. So, welcome.
And not in the Facebook Connect, you know, the movie Connect, but you can do that, but I see myself always as a connector. Calling myself a composer, performer is only really one part of who I am. I'm also an improviser, an educator, a producer, an audience, and I'm sitting in a room with everyone here who are all of these things as well. If we look at the triangle, this sort of Western European triangle of the elite composer on top, and then the performer in the middle, and the audience at the last rung, we honestly have to look at that triangle as sort of metaphor is dying. It's not really functional anymore, and all of these roles are blurring. The distinctions between who we are and what we are blurring. These are modalities that are transforming at an extremely rapid pace. How can I, as a composer, performer, improviser, work towards and maintain a sustainable transformation in the education of our students who are interested in the future of music? What do we need to do to offer roadmaps to a thriving career in the music industry? Well, I found that the more versatile I am, the more I've redefined myself as a flutist, the more chances I've had at succeeding. And I've seen that leaders in the academy are recognizing the value of preparing students for multiple skills in music, and some of those are not necessarily musical, as we've discussed. But somehow they transform into something else. So these non-traditional, more diverse pathways seem to be where many of us who are already steeped in this direction are leading our students. And who led the way? I mean, how did it happen that this distinction of the roles of the composer-performer melted into each other? Granted, the composer, improviser, performer is an ancient role. It's really only been the Western European model of history that these roles were compartmentalized into hierarchies. Little by little, various people led the way to dismantle this triangle and to create new definitions. So my experience has been based upon my interactions with people who have directly challenged me to rethink my role as an artist. I play outside the lines, outside staff lines, outside border lines, and I think that many of you do too. So fortunately, I was exposed to a wide variety of artists who not only shaped me and my artistic path, both loudly and quietly, but also have influenced the multi-directionality of the composer-performer of the 21st century. And I'm sure you can right now think of a few of your own of these kinds of people. Anne LaBerge, flutist and composer, was the first person to show me that anything is possible on the flute, that the flute is just a tool. She also showed me that I could live anywhere in the whole world to be successful doing whatever it is that I do. Dimanda Galas showed me that you must have a message. Without a message, without something that you believe in, there's nothing to say. Nia Masaoka showed me that the visual and the gestural have a very deep meaning in the sound. Charlotte Hoog is another artist who showed me these things about the body, the gesture, and everything that lays behind it. They showed me that electronics, the interactiveness of electronics, has everything to do with the body. They gave me permission to move. Martine Altenberger, a cellist south of France. She taught me about acceptance in this very moment. Every moment somehow sublime. Pauline Oliveros reminded me to be authentic. Authentically me. To imagine anything. Any risk I take will generate a possibility. These artists and so many others challenge me to rethink my identity. From being a mere flutist to engage with my own voice and body, my gender, my history, in profound ways that forever changed my life. And of course, I'm indebted to them. But I see them as, not as these labels, as performer, composer, improviser. I mean, they're all those things, but they are connectors. Those who connect the world around us, the worlds around us, and weave them together. As a performer, obviously, I'm the connector between the composer and the audience. As a performer, improviser, I have to make audible that which is not necessarily heard by others. But I can, instead of foresee, maybe forehear that which is sounding, or the potential of that which could be sounding at any given moment. I love this quote by Thelonious Monk, more or less something like this. You don't need to play everything. You can leave some things up to the imagination. I choose to leave that space in its place. My role as a connector leaves space for areas to develop, nurture, and grow. So my role as an educator is to facilitate that. To facilitate that other kind of learning, experience, knowledge. And I connect which others already may know and experience to, again, that potential of knowing and experiencing something else. So the students, for me, are the connectors. I recognize that there is nothing that I hear that is ever the same. Every sound is so unique. It's like a fingerprint, right? Every sound is always different. And that fingerprint touches you, leaves a trace. And so I just connect those traces. So these sounds are a mirror, these sounds, of what's already inside you, your stories, what is here in this experience. So we heard today many things in these last couple of minutes. We heard the Holgate Glaciers in Alaska. We heard birds in Mile Park, Botanical Gardens outside of Brisbane. We then went to Barcelona, where Augustine Fernandez and I were doing recording for the piano. Then we went to Kyoto, where I was chasing a street vendor and his mesmerizing cart that had this beautiful drone whistle. Well, he beckoned me with his beautiful voice to buy some sweet potatoes, baked sweet potatoes. Now we're in an art exhibit in Brooklyn where I composed this piece influenced by a woman poem written by Maria Negroni. So maybe all these sounds, the only real connector of it is me, because I went out and recorded them and compiled them here for you. Or maybe while you were listening, my voice just blended in and you created your own piece. Maybe while you were listening, you recognized some sounds that might have spurred some memories for you. All of these layers forming together in your own mind, your own experiences, your own stories. So whatever it was, your experience, you became a connector, or you involved yourself in the act of connecting.
Speaker today probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. David Rosen is a composer, performer, interdisciplinary artist, author, educator, and a pioneer in American experimental music. He currently holds the Richard Seaver Distinguished Chair in Music in the Herb Alpert School of Music at the California Institute of the Arts, where he has been Dean of the School of Music since 1990. Active since the 1960s, he has explored many facets of composition, performance, improvisation, technology, and the myriad ways in which they interact. His current projects include the called Propositional Music, which will be about compositional models and exploring the universe through exploring music.
Thank you. Beautiful performance. It reminds me of, I think it's Bateson, who talks about the ideas that connect. You know, any things that you can put on the table. I once had experienced a great one where he came into a class, pulled a live lobster out of his bag. Not a live, it was a dead lobster, out of his bag, put it on the table in front of the class. This was at the San Francisco Art Institute. And challenged the class with the following. He said, imagine that I'm a being from another planet. Your job for the next hour and a half is to convince me that this object is something that was once alive. So it could have taken a semester, but it took so the ideas that connect. Well, I'm going to talk about new graduate programs, so I'm going to talk about one that is relatively new for us. It's a new DMA program. New in that it's about 4 years old now, called the DMA Performer-Composer Program at CalArts. I'm already thinking performer-composer is a nomenclature, is a label, is waning in its usefulness. There are so many examples of why we don't need these things, and that's why I said collapsing distinctions. I had a great experience not long ago collaborating with some artists in Indonesia, and I got to share the stage with a group of Azmat from New Guinea, and they did what they called theater, which was basically to sample their life in a period of a day or two, because they actually don't distinguish art from life. They do it in a very refined way, but they don't even label it as something different than getting up in the morning and going about their day. Another interesting experience was at a conference of ethnomusicologists talking about improvisation that Bruno Nettle put together in Champaign-Urbana a few years ago, and I went back to play the great electronic instrument called the Salmar Construction. Remember that Salvatore Monterano developed? I was very close with him, and I knew how to play it, and there are only a couple people who do, because it had a big array, a panel with 291 touch switches, not one of which was labeled, and one had to be able to play it that way. And but it was an act of improvising, but improvising with what is in circuitry, in this case, an extension of someone's notion of a compositional world. So, in a sense, these things that we extend out from us are embodiments of our compositional minds and our improvisational bodies and our whole spirit. And how they mix up together is amazing. Well, at that conference that Nettle put together, there was a wonderful demonstration of someone who had interviewed a very old, venerated classical Persian musician. And a piece was demonstrated, and then the ethnomusicologist started to interview him afterwards. And at one point he got to the question, well, how much of that was composed? He said, all of it. But how much of that was improvised? All of it. Because he could not cognize the idea of the difference between the two. And in fact, the word improvisation doesn't really exist in other cultures in the way we use it. Where did it come from? Maybe stand-up theater at some point in the Western world, and then it got applied to music. But you look around cultures around the world and you try to find the word improvisation. It's very hard to find. People don't really use it because they don't distinguish it from music making. So there's the cognitive machinery that we build for ourselves has lots of hammers and screwdrivers that let us do all sorts of things. But it's useful to remember that they aren't there a priori. They aren't part of the universal grammar, which I think we are about ready to throw out now, or anything like that. So it's very interesting. So now we talk about performer-composer as an act of collapsing distinction, but maybe actually we're just in a process. We're just moving forward. These things are converging in a way that is very natural. And we have some extraordinary edifices of music that have been created during this little bubble of Western history, maybe 200-300 years, where the composer and performer had to become so specialized and had to be separated. Maybe we can say it's part of the industrialization of the world, or whatever. Many things we could connect it to, or maybe not connect it to, but it's what's happening. So I've been giving a lot of talks lately, and I often start. Well, first of all, just historically speaking, CalArts has had a performer-composer program now for, somewhere in the mid-90s. We started it. It started as an MFA program. Then we added an upper division BFA program, so students could enter it in their third year after going through some core curriculum in their first and second year undergraduates. And now we found that it was a natural thing to extend it to a doctorate program. I don't know another program like it, although I know that a lot of the things that we do overlap, and we have programs that, we have names for programs that are whatever they are, but there's a great deal of overlap. And this kind of work, of course, is not new. It's been going on for decades and decades in the U.S. in many institutions. We're just now trying to figure out how to respond to our particular socioeconomic climate, what's happening with what young people are doing, and what's going on in the outside world, and trying to make our academies more responsive to what the students are all doing. We're going through strategic planning at CalArts right now, also thinking about things like programs. Are programs relevant? Not so sure. And so, I keep saying to the faculty, well, go out in the hallway and look at what the students are doing. How can we make the academy support what they're already doing? We have lots of programs, and there's a great deal of fluidity across the programs in our school, but it doesn't look that way on paper necessarily. So how can we make the infrastructure to support what they're already doing? So I've been lately starting with this picture. If we get past this one, we have hope. Just to think that almost half of the 7 billion people on the planet Earth are under the age of 25 is rather staggering. What does that mean? And what are they like? And this is actually 2010 data from the United Nations demographic surveys. The colored lines are different parts of the world. The red one is Asia. The blue one is Africa. As you can see, is on a continuous increase. And the others, various others. What are they? As if they matter, they're so small. And what are they like? Well, they're predominantly poor. That's a global perspective, of course, because the bulk of them come from other parts of the world. They are globally connected, however. They are tuned in. They're collaborative and social. They like to work together. They have high expectations. They want to do things. They're hungry. They want attention, they look for feedback. They're creative, they're customizers, they're blending all kinds of aspects of their lives. They feel a sense of urgency, I think, that we've got to do something about the world we live in. And of course, they're concerned about the cost of education in our part of the world. They're inspirations. They're pan-stylistic. They get their inspiration from anywhere. The idea of schools of composition are gone, as I think we all are living these days. They're genre deviant is what I like. They almost like to work against the idea of the notion of a genre. They're collectively emergent. They feel social relevance, and they want to have a creative role in the music they play. So one of the things that I've done with some students is encourage them to make what we call sort of aesthetic maps. How would you array your sources of inspiration? Here's one of our DMA students. This is the aesthetic map of Kristen Erickson, who's a brilliant artist who created an astounding array of sources of where her inspiration comes from. So I just want to paint this background because we have to see these shifts that are going on, which are really quite amazing. Again, is it new? No. That's a score from a piece of mine from 1967. in which musicians must make essentially dictionaries of what all the symbols mean, and then the composition involves various ways to traverse this space. Actually, an infinite number of compositions can be created because it's basically a description of a universe of relationships. So that's 1967. We talk about technology. This is just a notion that I grabbed this from an article I wrote a long time ago, which proposed that the idea of that we could think about instruments. We used to use the word intelligent instrument. That's becoming a little bit passé now. We don't use that word. But we could think that a complex network, which may be created by humans, and another one, which may be humans themselves, are in a particular relationship. We distinguish what that relationship is, and we treat it as a musical entity, like a note. And we can compose with these relationships. And that's one way to go. This is the basis of a piece of mine called Two Lines, which I composed for my friend Anthony. In this case, there is software processing the gesture shapes that are being played, and the results are coming back on the second piano. There are actually two pianos. Here's another one from 1969. That's actually the cover of a recent CD that I just released on Sodic. It's actually the score of a piece for oboe and electronics. It's a duet. It's a score designed to be as timeless as I could make it in terms of technology. There's no specific instrumentation indicated, but there's functional indication. And this one happens to be just a minute of it. It says, and then the next one is, here's one in which, this is what I call a musical configuration space. It's actually a system of counterpoint, now I'm getting back to notes, in which there are musical units that are part of an overall contrapuntal and tonal kind of universe, and they work in such a way that the end of any one can be connected to the beginning of any other. And it's like configuration space is drawn from, is borrowed from physics. It's a space that shows all the possible relationships of a particular set of things, and it collapses into one realization when a performer finds their own way through it. This is for one organ, for trumpets. That happens to be my son, who's a trumpet virtuoso playing it, who it was written for. And so, okay, what do we do about this? Well, we create this performer-composer program because we found that if we could bring in really advanced artists for whom the conception of the integration of performance practice with compositional practice was so strong that they really could not be separated in the creation of their own voice, we would bring a really unique community of amazing artists into the school, and we would allow them the opportunity to develop a very high-level realization of their work and get a doctorate and then be marketable. In the academic world, where of course, as we all know, there are no jobs. So here we are. So we created this program, and this is the cover of a brochure. I happen to have a few here if any of you would like them. And some of you know the white-haired man in the middle. This Vinny Golia, of course, who's on our faculty. So this program, it's meant to end the minor bubble in the global history of music. And it's to move forward with many of this is off of our website. You don't have to read all the words, but you get the idea. So we're looking for these very unique artists. It's a highly competitive, limited program. We only take 2 a year, and it's a 3-year program. So that means at any one time we'll have 6. That limitation is largely financial and capacity driven. That's as many as we right now can fund. And they are amazing people. you can go to our website and or the brochure and read it. They have a set of requirements, and there is a rubric, and there are sets of learning goals. We all have to have them. And this is the way we've defined them and been able to get away with it. It is a very rigorous one. Our students are very involved with teaching. There's a strong teaching component. They teach for us, but they get a lot of pedagogical training as well, and they get professional development training. So they come out, when they come out, they will have a good resume that shows they have done quite a bit of interesting teaching. We do allow them to create their own courses, and we make them teach year training and theory and those things that we also need, and things that are particular to their specializations. It was a trick to get the accrediting agencies to understand that performer-composer is not a double major in composition and performance, but we did get through with that, and we got very high marks for the proposal when it was finally approved. So they come through right now. They have a fairly heavy course load at the beginning, where they take a small set of required courses. They have teaching practicums and various other things, and then when they get into their second year, it's largely research-driven with what we call topic-driven research classes, and then in their third year they do final projects. Every year they have a performance project, and they all have to produce a publishable paper, but it's a portfolio-driven program, not a thesis-driven program. You may have seen, I think, is it the current or the last issue of Chronicle of Higher Education that says the dissertation is broken? Okay, so we broke it. Come on, go ahead. Well, that's happening. I'm frozen. Go. There we go. These, you can just look quickly. These are what some of our students have done. One student became a real expert in developing a pedagogy for improvisation that drew on asymmetrical rhythms from Eastern Europe. Because there are so many of you here from UCSD, I have to tell you this one. Andrew Thole was a great violinist, composer. He made a companion piece for that piece of Roger Reynolds. Whoops. In which the percussion section includes a turntable. And that turntable is used as part of a cadenza on which he recorded 3 violin parts. Others have done other great things. This is a guy who is developing notation systems that, speaking of community outreach, he's been using this in disadvantaged communities in Brazil with kids, actually, developing compositional forms for them. This is a guy who has been, he actually also works with Ajay, who's developing a very unique approach to the relationship of Indian music and jazz. I got to show you this next one. This is a course that was developed by Kristen. She was interested in the idea of improvisation applied across the arts, and she developed an incredible class called Improvised Musical Theater, from which she developed a system of dealing with performance and algorithms. She developed a genetic algorithm system applied to performance instruction, in which instructions are sent out by performers to performers who hear things either on headphones or on their iPhones. Then she developed an iPhone app for that, and eventually a web app in which she has created these interactive ways of controlling theater groups. What she's really done is try to develop a blending of the idea of algorithmic formulation and performance. She actually had the students all line up and do a bubble sort where they all sorted themselves in a line that created a mode. And we have courses that I know time is up, but I'll just say one quick thing or two. And that is, this is a course I teach with a colleague from the dance school, in which the whole point is to take the notion of it's not about, here's my music, can you choreograph it? Here's my dance, can you make the music? It's about, can you in teams conceive of the idea that language, we take an anthropological view, language, music, gesture, all go back in human history to a point where you find they are not different. They are exactly the same thing. Start a compositional process from that point of view. So that's the way we approach sort of cross-disciplinary collaboration. Okay, so I know the time is up, so we have other things going on. I just do want to say we are working hard on knowing that our students and yours and everybody is going to be facing blended careers, and we're doing something we call creativity transfer, which is to try to, as a spin-off of the idea of technology transfer from a research institution to help students develop ways to become entrepreneurial. 50% of students, according to the latest SNAP survey, are doing blended careers. 80-some% of them are employed, but 50% of them are making half their income from a job outside the arts, while they also have something inside the arts. And that's just a reality we have to deal with. So we are working hard on that. I guess I've run out of time, so I'll stop there. Maybe we can have a conversation later. Okay.
Thank you. Our final speaker for this session is Michael Dessen. Michael is a composer, improviser who performs on the slide trombone and sorry. His music has been praised by critics in numerous jazz and contemporary music publications, and his music has been recorded on labels such as Clean Feed, Kinephone, and Circumvention. His teachers include Yusuf Latif, George Lewis, and Anthony. Currently teaches here at the University of California at Irvine, where he co-founded a new MFA emphasis in integrated composition, improvisation, and technology.
Thank you. And, you know, while I'm getting set up here, not mirroring, I have to say, I have to introduce Cecilia because she never even told you her name. She's so nice. She just showed up and moved right into it here. But Cecilia Son, who's our moderator, is actually a wonderful musicologist here in our department who's, among other things, specializes in experimental music. So you can get a chance to meet her. And I hope that turning the lights down like this doesn't put you all to sleep. You're welcome to nap if you want, but I'm going to do my best to keep you awake and get you energized for Mari's keynote, which is after this session. My topic, studying jazz studies, I'm not really going to give you a history of jazz studies because that would be kind of a boring thing to do, but I just want to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of a couple aspects of that history. One is, according to me, jazz education before jazz education is a phrase that I pulled from the Grove Dictionary, believe it or not. And actually this refers to, as early as the 1920s, a constellation of high school teachers and faculty at historically black colleges and universities across the United States, in African American communities. These are some of the many people that were teaching jazz at this time, and this is way before jazz ever made any mark in white higher educational institutions. So the list of people, of musicians that actually graduated from these kind of programs, in other words, had part of their formation, is kind of staggering. I could put up literally 5 more slides like this with names that anybody who knows jazz would recognize. I mean, many, many famous people in the field of jazz actually received some kind of training at the high school or college level, often from other jazz musicians who their day gig was doing that. So a couple points about this. One is that African American communities have always worked to establish institutional frameworks for their own artistic and intellectual empowerment. And another is that educational institutions have always played a part in jazz's evolution. Now, this is not to say that, the school was always the main thing. Of course, there's a very important role of both things like musicians collectives and also informal networks of musicians, and the kind of education that goes on in the bandstand, the kind of mentoring in bands and in professional life, which of course has, you could say that it's always eclipsed the role of schools in the history of jazz. But I make this point because it's more important to think about educational formation of musicians as kind of an ecosystem of possibilities. And there's often this mythic idea of the street. You hear this a lot. There's this kind of virgin birth of jazz in the street, and, school is just this kind of aberration. But actually, institutions have always played a role. I'm not going to give you this whole history. I'm going to put up this for just a second. You can try and read it if you're fast at that kind of thing. But really, there was this gradual development during the 40s and 50s, and then kind of an explosion of jazz education and jazz studies at the higher ed level in the 60s, really started in 1959. And there were many aspects to this. One, the Lennox School was very important in western Massachusetts with great jazz artists like Dizzy Gillespie, Charles Mingus, Max Roach teaching, and people like Ornette Coleman coming through, and David Baker, a very important jazz education pioneer. So that you have, after 1959, you have a codification of the field of jazz education and real growth, so that by the end of the century, jazz was an indelible feature on the academic landscape throughout the U.S. And a little disclaimer here, I'm talking only about the U.S. I don't know enough about European and Canadian and other areas, institutions, so I'm focused here. But one quote here from David Baker, who's one of the real important figures in establishing jazz at the higher ed level. He said, people like to think that this happened overnight. This is a long, arduous, hard-fought battle. So I want to pause for a moment here and say I'm very grateful for all these generations of people who fought this battle. In case the rest of my talk makes it sound like I'm not, I really am. In fact, I'm very aware that I'm very much a product of that work that several generations of musicians had to do, and it's really an understatement that it was hard fought. I mean, this was, particularly mid-century, this was a very difficult task. Anyone who's a faculty member in here knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's also important to understand that even though he says it was a long battle, it's actually kind of mind-blowing that from the late 1940s, when you start to see in mainstream white higher ed institutions the first inklings of any attention and inclusion to jazz, courses and degrees, late 1940s, really by the late 1980s, you could not go to college anywhere in the United States and not be able to take a jazz history course. So if you think about 40 years going from 0 to 100 miles per hour, again, those of you that are faculty and have spent 500 hours in a faculty meeting debating some, 3-word bylaw in your department, amendments or whatever, you know that these institutions are glacial, right? And so that for that 40 years to go from nothing to everywhere is an amazing accomplishment, and it's actually very fast on some level. And now that it's everywhere, there's this kind of sense, if you talk to people, among some people, although I would say not all, but among many people in higher ed, that battle's over. It's kind of like it's done. It's mission accomplished. We're all set. We got jazz up in here. We got jazz degree programs, jazz courses, and we're all ready. We don't have to talk about this anymore. Now we could focus on how to teach people to play a 2-5-1 a little better, or how much avant-garde to include. That's a big debate. People like to talk about that. And I'm not really that interested in all those pedagogical details anymore. I used to be, but I find them kind of boring to talk about now because they're there, but I'm much more interested in the kind of stepping back larger issues. How is jazz constructed in these educational institutions? And these two questions I'm putting up here now. How has this process changed? The second one, how we understand the last century of Western art music's evolution. These are questions that there's no really quick answer. I'm not trying to say that I can answer these questions. These are very problematic kinds of questions. But I really think that rather than think of mission accomplished, we need to revisit these questions constantly and think about the legacy of this music and how we are constructing its space in these institutions. So in order to do that, I want to highlight a couple things. One is a sort of a dialectic tension whereby jazz had to enter these spaces as a kind of an other, really the other art music, kind of the black other side of the coin of complex, sophisticated art music to classical music. So it does have a very distinct set of histories, as anybody who studied jazz knows. But at the same time, jazz in America in the 20th century was an interwoven set of musical practices and communities that really had threads moving in and out of all other kinds of communities throughout the century, particularly in mid-century and beyond. I mean, it's incredibly powerful to look at that aspect of the story, which is much harder to institutionalize and teach. And David's point about, trying to move to a model at CalArts with absolutely no programs would be a pretty radical way to sort of just say, well, it's all open. And that's, people kind of freak out. But that's one way of thinking. Like that would be the other spectrum that hasn't, a side of the spectrum that hasn't really been explored too much. It's just conceiving of jazz as this sort of interrelated aspect of American musical life. So in order to talk about the kind of challenge here and some of the history of how jazz in the past has become constructed within these institutional spaces, I want to use two metaphors, and the first one I'm going to borrow from a wonderful historian, Sherry Tucker, who wrote a great book called Swing Shift on all-girl bands of the 1940s. And I heard her use this metaphor at a conference once when she was talking about the challenge of doing revisionist history, in her case on the contributions of women throughout jazz history. She talked about how it's not enough to just overdub a new track onto the existing jazz history. You know, if you just come in and say, well, I've dug up all this great information about all these women, and it's like those little sidebars we have in the textbooks now where they talk about, oh, now all these women in the 1940s, now let's get back to the, you know, the bebop people that we really want to talk about. So there's this idea that like, if you just, in what she was saying was if you're just overdubbing a new track, you know, and it doesn't do anything to change the way we think about our existing canons and understanding of history, if it doesn't give us any new insight into the histories as we're teaching and understanding them now, you've kind of failed as a revisionist historian. You're not just there to dig up new information. The other metaphor I want to use is even a little bit more charged, but I'll do it, and I hope nobody's too pissed off at this. But separate but equal is, of course, a legal doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 19th century, and it was an idea that in U.S. law and society really created a foundation legally for segregation for almost a century after emancipation. So, of course, we all know that the facilities were not really equal. But this idea that if you just provide separate but equal facilities, everything's going to be cool, right? So that idea is kind of, it's maybe, I don't want to suggest that there's some nefarious kind of conspiracy going on to keep jazz in its place in higher ed, but I do want to use that idea to talk about some of the ways in which jazz is constructed. So I'm going to actually skip over this stuff on demographics, but there's this great study, if anybody wants to look it up, by a guy, Lou Fisher, who did a master's study talking about the demographics of the typical jazz program, how it's basically white, male, middle-aged, and people with a lot of teaching experience. And then there's faculty statistics that there are not many great studies, but on the lack of African Americans in music departments in the country, it's kind of staggering to look at, really. So one thing that I wanted to ask about was kind of like, if you have this 40-year trajectory, in 40 years, it's mind-blowing that we could go from 0 to 100 in 40 years, and now jazz is everywhere in institutions, but the people from communities that actually created this music and are most closely associated with it culturally really didn't, they could not surf that ride, you know, they couldn't get into the institution in quite the same way. So I'm not going to get into that. That's a very charged topic, and it's difficult to talk about in a way that gets at the complexity of it, because I think we all know a lot of the reasons that that's difficult to work on, but it brings up many questions. I'm going to kind of sidestep those right now, but go into two examples of how jazz is constructed. One is the blues and the story of tonality in the way we teach music theory. Music theory, of course, being a really important central idea in how we train musicians in music departments. As many of you know, undergraduates typically have to take a couple of years of music theory. They study all this stuff, tonal harmony, you know, common practice period forms. And textbooks are now starting to include these popular music excerpts. You know, they're like we'll include a little Lionel Richie song to show you the sequence of fifths and stuff. It's just kind of to make it go down a little easier. But they don't really, they're still teaching it in pretty much the same way they used to. And jazz theory is always a separate course that only the jazz majors have to take. Thank you. And so it's optional, you know, for the classical musicians. So we teach both the jazz students and the classical students. We teach this story of tonality, right? That in the 1700s, tonality comes along and emerges, gets codified. 1800s, expanded by the end of that century, you know, you got the big guys pushing it around, and then it gets knocked out of the park and it dissolves and new things come back. But we can still do it anyway now because we can do anything now. So that's the sort of soap opera of tonality that we teach in these music theory courses, basically. And my question really is, how does the emergence of the blues in the late 1800s and early 1900s, what does it have to do with this story? And that's because, for one thing, the blues, and again, going back to the Grove, you know, the standard reference, right? The Grove, I think, I don't have it here, but they refer to the blues as the most influential or dominant form in popular music on all popular music in the 20th century. And of course, the blues being created by, you know, people with very few resources. But when you think about the blues, most of my students would call it a tonal music. They're not going to say the blues is atonal. There's a key center. It uses tertiary harmony. But in fact, the blues is actually signifying on tonality and on the codes of tonality in some very interesting ways. it inverts and reverses some of the key codes of tonality. One is the 5/4 progression, which, you know, this is about as backwards as you can get. It literally goes backwards in the charts that some of these tonal textbooks use. And the other is this great dominant seventh sonority that at the time that the blues was invented collectively by many people across a pretty wide geographic region, the dominant seventh sonority was in classical music and most kinds of Western music was about the most tense thing you could have, right? If you're on one, you gotta go somewhere else. Well, the blues, it's like you can hang there all day. It's just home, it's fun. James Brown will stay there for an evening. You know, you can just be on the dominant seventh chords. This is something that is now part and parcel of our understanding of tonality as 21st century human beings. And this is due to the blues, you know, that was collectively authored by so many people. But we don't teach it this way. We don't even include it in the story of tonal harmony as we teach it. So I find that fascinating, and to sort of understand why that might be, I got a quote here from Leo Treitler, who is not some radical black power person. He's actually a very well-respected musicologist who studies medieval and Renaissance music. But he wrote this great article for the Black Music Research Journal now a long time ago, and he was referring to the paradigm shift in musicology. He writes, "The historiographic paradigm that one could describe some 30 years ago appeared under close analysis of its logic to be quite circular, producing histories with premises that assumed conclusions and conclusions that repeatedly reaffirmed premises. And rather than being driven by the force of logic and evidence, as was believed, it appeared rather to model cultural self-images that are immanent in the very idea of a Western European classical tradition. It is history functioning as myth, providing criteria for the representation of music." So I want you to think about that as I do one other quick example here at the end, which has to do with John Coltrane, a very iconic jazz figure, of course, and Steve Reich, an equally iconic American composer, one of the most celebrated quote-unquote classical composers of our time. So Steve Reich, of course, did some grad studies up at Mills, and he heard Coltrane's band from the early and mid-60s, and like many composers of the time, was very influenced by Coltrane. And so, however, we don't normally teach these people in the same history courses. Now, some people who are super cool probably do, like Cecilia, but in most schools, they don't get taught together. You learn about Coltrane in the jazz history course, and you learn about Steve Reich in the classical, 20th century composition course or whatever, but you don't normally hear them talked about even in many of the same conversations. But in fact, one of the things that people note about Steve Reich, and it's not really his invention, but he's associated very much with this in Philip Glass, is that he was one of the people in this generation of composers who started to lead their own ensembles. And as George Lewis pointed out to me, the model for that was jazz. And it wasn't just, I want to emphasize that it's not just a sort of a practical model, like I want to start my own band, but there's another dimension to it. Steve Reich says, Coltrane, on the development of his ensemble, he's talking about it in these terms. He said, Coltrane was the model. When I went to graduate school at Mills, there were people who were writing these incredibly complex pieces, but no one sat down at the piano and played the piece. I'm not really sure if they heard it in their heads or not. Coltrane would just get up and the music would come out. So it's not just a musical contrast, it's almost an ethical, moral contrast. And I felt, whatever my limitations, I'm going to be in my own pieces. And that was pretty much the guiding principle from that point on. So I'm not trying to make the point that everybody should be in their own pieces or it's immoral, I'm now actually starting to write fully notated music, to my great surprise. And, there are many people like Steve Reich who, he said this, but of course now he writes fully notated music that he's not on, so the point is not that there's some kind of dogmatic ethical position you have to take that comes from jazz. My point is more about historiography, to get back to the Treitler quote again, and just to sort of wrap this up. If you think about this quote in relation to this image of Coltrane and Steve Reich, and you think about the fact that we now conceive of them and have institutionalized them in these very separate tracks, I think when we look back in 50 to 100 years on what we're doing now and the way we're understanding and representing these different musical traditions, particularly since mid-century, this is already ringing true for me, but I think it's going to make a lot more sense to people later on. The fact that we've been teaching and constructing histories through paradigms that really do assume conclusions that are based more on our understanding of who we are culturally and racially in particular, than we do actually looking at the way that ideas and practices have circulated in 20th century music. So I think particularly as academics, we have some kind of an intellectual responsibility, I gather, that we should really be reflecting on what the histories really tell us about where these musics came from and how that is part of shaping who we are as musicians and who we are culturally. And if we're going to take seriously these critiques that appear in these kind of journals and musicology and so forth. Again, this is almost 20 years ago now that he wrote this about the paradigm shift in musicology, but essentially, I don't see a whole lot of change going on in terms of the way we're actually teaching things. So I'm more throwing this out, as a set of ideas to create a framework, not as I really don't have any practical advice for anybody about how to apply any of these realizations, but more to get you thinking and help me think through these questions about this dialectic tension of difference and the other. So I had some other comments about technology and world music, but I'm going to leave it at that because other people have said great things about that, and let's just call it a day. So thank you very much. Turn the lights on so we can wake up now.
Thank you. We have 14 minutes for questions and discussion.
Just to comment on you were talking about the way tonality is taught. One of my very first teaching positions was as an adjunct, and I taught the freshman ear training portion of a big theory group. And so we're having a meeting with the faculty, and when they were testing the ear training of sonorities, they said if you played, C, E, G, B flat, they wanted to call it a major minor seventh chord. And in the meeting I said, nobody calls it that. It's a dominant seventh chord. And I got all this blowback that, well, no, it's only a dominant seventh chord if it's on the fifth. And I said, I don't know what y'all have been doing, but if you go out in the real world and say major minor seventh chord to somebody, nobody's going to know what you're talking about. That wasn't a well-received comment. And this wasn't that long ago, so it really was, and this was a school where half the kids in these classes were jazz studies majors. And they still just wouldn't call it a dominant seventh chord, which is what it is, right? That's not a question, it's just back up to what you said. It still happens.
I have a question, I guess. I've been thinking a lot about composition and improvisation because I'm working on this project about Tony Conrad and Lamont Young and endless fights about who wrote what and what does it mean to be a composer and an improviser and the way that we tell history and who has ownership and so on and so forth. I came across a really interesting thing that Conrad said specifically about Reich's ensemble and Glass's ensemble, where he really puts them back into this very traditional, for want of a better word, classical music avant-garde mode, and he's really interested in control, right? This is the music that I see Reich writes, and then you have to play it to perhaps an even higher degree of specificity and control than even say like Bach or Mozart or whatever. Because I'm rounding my way to a slightly convoluted question. I'm interested to know from all the speakers today what your thoughts are on this sort of specific relationship between composition and improvisation. When do you see it changing in the recent history of music and the way that we tell this recent history of music? I know that's a very good question.
Well, I'll try to be general, but I played with Lamont Young for many years and with Tony, and saw how that goes. And I don't want to get involved in the debate because they're both good friends. But I guess I would see there's a spectrum of relationships that has to do with what is specified and what is not, and what is agreed and what is not, and how much and how little. That's totally perfectly healthy. And in other words, it's perfectly fine for a composer to say, this is exactly what I want, you have to do exactly this. And someone can say, well, I don't want to play that kind of music. So, or you do it. Or it's fine to say, here is a template I invite you to use. And then you say, well, okay, if you get stuck in the ownership thing, it gets really kind of nasty. And it's nice when, I like to take cues from cultures where that's not always such an issue, where where forms are culturally owned rather than individually owned so much. On the other hand, in the West, there are certain things about it. I mean, as I was just listening the other day to a recording I made of a piece that was written for me by composer Michael Byron, which is a formulation of things. I actually put a lot of work into realizing, even calculating things and figuring out how things fit with someone who made this recording and so on. That was my choice to do it. It's still his piece because he initiated it and has this structure that was offered, as an invitation to go inside and work with. A raga doesn't belong to somebody, right? But yet it evolves over generations, and people play it and work with it. Yet there are also fixed compositions, in Indian music, there's the raga. But so there's this. I think there's this huge spectrum, and it's all good. As long as you sort of place yourself there on purpose, and you say, okay, this is what I'm doing. And you acknowledge what you're doing. And then you say, okay, you give it away, and then people can use it or not.
And I also think like students need those experiences of playing all those different kinds of compositions. So you need the experience as a performer to have those compositions where you do everything that's written on the page, but also there's a whole array of, as you said, a spectrum of compositions where the performer's involved in the choice making, or the structure, or specific things about it, timbral issues, I don't know, just choices that are made that are, which is what got me started happening, where I started to have to forced to make choices, where my role in the composition is sort of melted into, you have more of a responsibility to create. And then there's other pieces where you have graphic scores and things. But I think if we give our students opportunities to have all of these experiences playing music that's inspired by various cultures and various parts around the world, then we're giving them opportunities to explore their own vocabulary, artistic vocabulary.
And it doesn't have to be about the page.
No, it doesn't have to be about the page.
It could be highly worked out music that's transferred orally only, right?
Absolutely.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
And what about treatise? Cardew
Absolutely.
Used to participate in a number of performances with Cornelius of that piece. Really, what he did was create an event.
Exactly.
It was, okay, treatise will occur starting at 4 o'clock on this date and going till 1 in the morning in this location, and you're invited to be a part of it. So you take the score with no instructions. There were instructions written later, but at first there were none. And then you show up, and you contribute. You play for a while, and you don't have to enter, you play some more. So it was like that. But there's sufficient conceptual origination to associate it with him.
Okay. This is I think there's a distinction that is in the book Noise, but I don't think that was the first or last place that it was pointed out. But basically the difference in the West, because it's still fundamentally a Western distinction. The distinction in the West between composition and improvisation is one about money, because you can copyright and get royalties for composition, and you can't for improvisation. And that, to me, seems to be all that this is about, actually. I don't think it's about anything else.
It's true. And then, of course, Stockhausen tried to notate the electronic pieces later, after creating them, in order to be able to copyright a score, right? In certain cases. Although he made, Jaap did it all, and so far Cornelius did some of it, because he couldn't copyright the composition with a tape.
But I think even beyond this, it becomes ways of regulating who's paid, and it was a way of not paying improvisers. work of theirs that was documented and reproduced. So I don't know that it really is about anything else besides this simple distinction that what's composed is exactly this thing that we can get, and that's and
It's a copyright. It's a notation. It's because we have to have thing on paper.
but you can get publishing for something that is not notated, so it's really just, to me, it just seems about who gets paid. I don't, and then it becomes about power and about race and about all these other things. I would be happy to be proven wrong, but I'm not actually sure that there's anything more to it.
Right, which ties to the idea of ownership.
Yeah.
I like very much what you're saying, and this is I think, very interesting way of looking at this. Because I remember myself saying today, actually, that I'm talking to you about composition and not improvisation, so clearly in my head these things somehow are different. And I guess there are a couple of things, a couple of ways why they are, and it's about whether, how and at which moment certain things are fixed. There's a little bit of what you were talking about being in time or out of time. And so the process of when you compose and at which point and when it gets fixed, there's probably that aspect that how, to what extent some of the pre-composition or whatever happened and how that's maybe a little different. And also just this idea of fixing, I think that now, of course, improvisation, because it can get recorded, the money issue also got equal on that. So certain things you can get your royalties from the recording as much from composition as from improvisation. So I guess this just gets blurred somewhat there.
But I guess I would say that the only reason that we care
Yeah.
is because it.
No. Yeah.
Because of money.
I think there's a little more to it. I agree with you to some extent, but I think they can be different, and not in a power politics way, but just that some things, some musical conception needs to be written down. And I guess my argument would be, if you say wanted to have 100 musicians playing together, like an orchestra, really hard to do that without notating. So there's a practical element, and some things can just be conceptualized easier or better or differently by writing them down, and other things don't need that. And there are the power and politics issues, but that I wouldn't say it came down to only that.
Well, there is one other thing that was actually that kind of relates to something you said at the beginning, which is that people want to know. Like people will ask, what percentage of that is
All the time.
all the time? Now, I actually was thinking about this a lot recently because I wrote an article for George's Anthology on improvisation studies, and it was kind of related to some of the stuff I was talking about this morning about action understanding. Now, I think that improvisation is not something that we can exactly hear, but that we are trained by cultural cues to recognize or imagine that we do. So, in other words, that improvisation doesn't exactly sound like anything. But when you listen with the idea that this is being improvised, then there's something like action understanding activated where you feel, oh, that could be me taking those chances right now, making those choices. And that's the other way in which it matters, which is that for a listener, it matters to know that could be them, or that there's just that kind of embodied connection, that empathy that happens. So that's maybe the opposite of what I said earlier. They're both true.
I want to just comment on Michael what Stevie Wright said about forming his ensemble and releasing it. I understood it as being much more practical than the reason, because I heard it from Philip Glass himself when I was in his class long ago, whatever time it has been. When students asked him, he said very plainly, I couldn't get anybody to play my music,
That's right.
so I had to do this.
Mhm.
And that was, I think, maybe he's still revising on his own story. People do this all the time, you know.
True.
So I think that seems more plausible. And then the other part he said was that once he got going playing his music, what he realized was that once they were getting more booked and getting known, that he really had to make it more like those rock groups. Because people come to the concert now knowing the tunes,
Mhm.
so that reproduction can
Right.
move.
Which is not exactly the direction that Coltrane went in.
Yeah, exactly. So
It's
I
kind of the
just
opposite
don't think
type of
I
development.
think it's
But, yeah.
We have time for just one more.
So I also wanted to talk about or ask about what you were talking about, Michael. I mean, I think if I detect the possible curricular proposal in what you're saying correctly, it resonates really strongly with a lot of what Glenn was saying before about, it can't just be an overdub. We need to really I don't know what the appropriate word is, not deterritorialize, not decolonize, but some word that has some of the ring of both of those things, so that it's not just the Western thing as the baseline, everything else is optional. I just wanted to, I went to SEM a number of years ago, and the keynote said, we used to say, ethnomusicologists used to say, we wanted to be, incorporated into what the musicologists are doing and have a place at the table. But really, what we should have been saying is they need to be incorporated into what we're doing, and so that what's happening with Western music in the academy is viewed comparatively and with the lens of cultural theory and as one option among many and not as the base thing off of which all other things need to be built. So just as a practical, matter, people I think who are interested in thinking through this should find the ethnomusicologists around them, because I think they have very similar goals in terms of restructuring musical knowledge in the academy.
Yeah, I agree. Many of them do. But I think in all of these fields, there's just a lot of people with different backgrounds who see things in their own personal way, which is great. So, who said that? Dad Wong? Who was it that said that?
It was,
That's a good comment.
yeah.
I like it. But anyway, I think rather than, usually when these discussions open up, including, or not including this symposium yet, actually, which is super cool, but when they open up, people often want to say, here's my curricular proposal. This is why it's so cool, and you guys should do it too. And my attitude is kind of like, no, you can only teach from where your understanding comes from, for one thing. You have to actually have lived something to teach it well, right? So, I think, it's kind of like let 1,000 flowers bloom or whatever. If people just go out and teach all kinds of ways, we'd be a healthy culture. It's this idea that there's this hegemonic story that we need to tell about ourselves, that one particular subgroup has determined to be the legitimate one that defines these particular practices like Western art music. Whereas actually the picture of Western art music is a lot more complex. Which is exactly another way of saying what you're saying, that musicologists have focused on this one picture of Western art music, this story. And as Traylor said, he's writing the lines down. This guy is like as mainstream musicologist as you can get. He's saying that we really need to think about this differently, not as a myth about who we are and embedded in a music theory and music history curriculum. So as long as people can open up in ways that they've lived and are more true to their experience, I think we're in good shape.
What's interesting is that jazz history tells the same way soap opera about itself.
Right.
We
could look at that so much
evolution of
too.
styles.
Right.
It's very similar.
Right.
Thank you very much.